the best of Money Matters.
Welcome to the big story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Imagine hopping into a ride with no driver, just smooth, smart technology getting you from point A to point B. Well, Singapore is getting ready to make that a reality, and soon. The country is poised to make a big push for self-driving vehicles to be deployed across the island in the next 5 years. Acting Transport Minister Jeffrey Siow says it is all part of a bigger plan to strengthen our public transport network, especially for those living in HDB estates farther from the city center. And this move comes more than a decade after Singapore first started testing self-driving technology. So could self-driving vehicles be the game changer Singapore's transport system has been waiting for? Well, joining us today to share more is Terence Fan, who is the Assistant Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship and Academic Director of Accreditation at Singapore Management University. Hi, Professor Fan. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Well, Professor, Singapore's acting Transport Minister Jeffrey Siow recently laid out a bold plan to roll out self-driving vehicles across the island in the next few years. Now, we understand that Singapore has been exploring autonomous transport since at least 2014, but we haven't really seen widespread adoption. What do you make of this ambitious announcement? Do you think the timing is right 10 years into that original idea?
Yeah, actually, autonomous vehicles, there are different stages, and it takes quite a bit of time to make sure that the technology is acclimatized to our operating environment, the weather, traffic, and how roads are being shared by motorists and also pedestrians alike. So earlier on, 10 years ago, yes, we did, gingerly tiptoe with some tests, and we still do currently, have some autonomous vehicles in certain confined areas of Singapore. So not like all of Singapore, but in several places. So that experience allows us to gather a lot of information on how the technology works, and allows the technicians to understand different scenarios that could play out. And I think this is where the time, the number of years of operation is needed, because a lot of times the scenarios may not come about very frequently. You want to combine things like, torrential downpour and then rain, and then just a new piece of newspaper or something flying across the street to see whether the autonomous vehicles are able to accurately judge whether that's really a person or not, or you have a small child running during the rain or something like that. And then you want to make sure that the autonomous vehicle does not mistake that as a piece of newspaper or cardboard, So that's the kind of thing that takes a long time to make sure we iron out these things. And I think now with the trial, we are gaining confidence, and also the technology in other countries have also evolved at the same time, so that we feel that confident enough. I think it's a bold step, but hey, like all things in Singapore, what I would think is that it's not going to be 100% of the buses and public transport suddenly becoming autonomous. It's most likely going to be a small scale and then gradually increasing a bit and a little bit at a time. Yeah,
Well,
so it's definitely a watershed, a milestone of sort, but at the same time, don't expect overnight, you're gonna not see the bus captains at all.
Definitely. Well, but what has changed in terms of technology or social norms that makes this current plan different from earlier efforts?
I think both in terms of the technology elsewhere in other countries that are developing, that we have seen progression, although we've also seen some setbacks. In some cases, autonomous vehicles were pulled off the streets, in sort of fairly abrupt manner. But at the same time, we are also kind of drumming up interest in Singapore, becoming more active in the EV technology or perhaps even production of sort. So it would be kind of ironic if Singapore aspires to, take on that role and at the same time kind of be overly conservative on the use and adoption of autonomous vehicles. So I think we are seeing the technology improve elsewhere. B, we have sufficient amount of local experience, and C, there might be some drive or interest in Singapore becoming more economically active in this EV ecosystem globally. So I think all of these things are kind of tipping us gently into the wider use of autonomous vehicles.
Okay, but what signals the government sending with this announcement, do you think?
I think the government is saying that Singapore is not afraid of new technology. In fact, is trying to, I wouldn't say completely leading the way in terms of leading the technology in the world, but I think certainly Singapore is one of the more progressive countries that are sort of, and the regulatory authority in public transport is widely respected. And so I think it's making that careful, calculated step. It speaks volumes in terms of what how Singapore trusts the level of technology that's been developed in terms of the autonomous vehicle technology, right?
Mm.
Yeah, so yes, something that we definitely should be very proud of. But at the same time, I think you have to really look a little bit to really take the AV. But certain communities, those communities that were served, then they may be suddenly a little bit surprised. Hey, where's our bus captain today?
Definitely. Well, one of the key reasons cited by Mr. Siow for this plan is the challenge of manpower, including the difficulty in recruiting and retaining bus drivers. Can autonomous vehicles realistically help alleviate this constraint, though? How scalable is the solution to what is clearly a long-standing issue?
Yeah, it's definitely a long-standing issue. I was gonna say that it's especially since COVID-19, we're kind of coming out of it and so on. And right after that, there's a big, human resource crunch. All of a sudden, all of the sectors are opening, and bus captains were also part of it, was not spared of that. So with the autonomous vehicles, the thing is you don't need a bus captain, so you don't need to give the lunch breaks and the small breaks in between. The autonomous vehicles can run nonstop. So it definitely increases the efficiency. And at the same time, it kind of eliminates the person. I don't think it's completely zero. So there probably in the early stages, just at least there will be some sort of human monitoring, but I don't think it's a one human monitor to one bus. It's sort of one person probably monitoring a number of
Mhm.
autonomous operated buses, and then so it saved definitely on the manpower. And I think the manpower is also part of the operating costs that will have to be borne by the LTA at this point, or at sooner or later, all of it will have to be borne by the Land Transport Authority. So in this sense, it allows more buses to be run independent of whether or not we're able to get the bus captains.
Mhm.
Number two, because the operating cost, because now you don't have to pay the bus captains. And with the autonomous technology, as with all of these high tech technologies, usually you have a huge upfront cost. You've got to
Mhm.
know the system, you've got to set up everything, you've got to train everybody to how to monitor all these things. But once you get the system rolling, then every new bus routes that you add on, the incremental costs, the increases in the cost will be very minimal.
Mhm.
So in that sense, it's once you get a system up and coming and rolling, then adding new routes, adding new stops, and so on would be, literally just pressing a few buttons on a keyboard. So that really saves, time in training the bus captains on new routes or changes. And also it allows perhaps more routes to be opened up, because then you can now run autonomously operated buses at a lower cost than maybe with the one with the real bus captains, perhaps.
Mhm.
And at the same time, because you have a lower cost, you are now able to perhaps serve a few more communities that were otherwise maybe the traffic is not as much to traditionally warrant a bus service. But now with this autonomous vehicle, maybe you could, and maybe it's more economical to even have smaller capacity buses to serve these places as well. So that, it potentially also gives more flexibilities in terms of serving different communities.
Right. Well, I believe back in 2019, Professor, the Land Transport Authority pursued a 2040 goal of creating 20-minute 30-minute towns and a 45-minute city where commuting becomes much faster and more predictable. How do you see self-driving vehicles fitting into this broader goal?
Well, in order to have this lofty goal, we need to continuously improve and tweak our public transport system. And also at the same time, let's not forget new towns are, they keep on popping up, and even in some of the old established townships, newer parts of them are being developed to the extent that, some of them may require a bit of a walk to the closest bus interchange and so on. So having the autonomous vehicles, it alleviates some of the bus captain's issues, and it perhaps would allow a little bit more efficient deployment into different routes or changing different routes and so on, so that they, are able to serve the public better, so that, it's faster, or at least we can aim to achieve that lofty goals in 2040 or so. So I think it's part of the plan. I don't think it's the whole plan, but it certainly is an increasingly important component that would work independent of our human resource situation.
But do you think that this will become more challenging now that Singapore is also building more new towns and housing projects?
Oh, yes, but the same is true. If you have human bus captains, they also have to learn new routes and so on.
Right.
So it's a matter of your upfront costs. Are we planning everything, programming everything, and then incrementally running the thing will not cost very much, versus we're not going to spend that upfront cost, but then every time you add a bus, you're going to need a bus captains. Every time you want to shorten the headway of the buses, which means every amount of time that, any commuter would need to wait at a particular bus stop for their next bus to come. If you want to shorten that headway, you need buses to be run more frequently, and that meant more buses and more need for bus captains. So if we can somehow take away a little bit of the constraint of the bus captains, then there are more operational flexibility for that.
Right. Well, Professor Mr. Siow also referenced cities like San Francisco and Guangzhou as examples of the development of self-driving vehicles. Now, in San Francisco, you have Waymo robotaxis that are already on the roads, and in Guangzhou, the scale of deployment is accelerating fast. So how do you think Singapore's approach will compare? I mean, what are the unique challenges that we have here, and can we adopt any lessons from them?
Well, yeah, definitely. I think the fact that Singapore is or has not been sort of too far ahead or too much of a hurry in adopting autonomous vehicles so far is that Singapore wants to see what's happening. And in San Francisco, yes, they are going around town, but at least one of the operators had actually been ordered to stop, their fleet altogether. So there were some teething issues. So by going a little bit slower initially, I think Singapore is able to take in some of the lessons from these places and then sort of and then we also have our own experiments and very limited runs in different areas. So I think it's a great platform to build on. There are certain unique situations in terms of the weather, the kind of torrential downpours that we have combined with a very humid kind of environment. And then you have some of the local situations in some of the town or markets areas. People, they may have a little bit few more pedestrians, some with goods, on a trolley and so on. So that's the kind of thing I think we would like the autonomous vehicles to get more experience. I'd expect the rollout to be, to take this into account, so that all of the unexpected scenarios would have been ironed out and beforehand. So hopefully, once these autonomous vehicles run as part of public transport, the reliability is still there. So I think that's the key. But I think in
Definitely.
San Francisco, definitely at one point in time, one of the fleet was just like ordered to stop,
Uh-huh.
So we wouldn't want that. And I think there were some unexpected situations such as emergency vehicles and so on that kind of confused the autonomous vehicle, because ultimately they kind of have to be programmed in somehow to recognize these situations or diagnose the situations correctly, as humans would want to. And I think that's where Singapore can take some of the lessons.
Right. Well, beyond the vehicles themselves, Professor, what kind of supporting infrastructure would Singapore have to consider this in the plans to roll out self-driving vehicles?
Well, it's a very good question. I think that's part of the learning that we may have to, understand because, for example, there are a lot of mundane things. For example, people, even I would sometimes come up to the bus captain and ask, do you take this street or do you make a turn? But now if you don't have the bus drivers and the bus captains anymore, then it's like, okay, I guess you have to rely on your phone. So I think in terms of commuters, they may have to adjust a bit. And the question, of course, is how does one pay the cash fare? Can one still do that, for example? Or if things kind of, if your cards don't tap right and so on. So if there are things that actually don't quite go as expected, what would happen? And I think that's the kind of thing we would like to see iron out. At the same time, there's a little bit of confidence we have to build up in the commuters and saying, hey, there's no one driving this vehicle. So is it still, is it safe? I think that's a little bit of a hurdle initially. But I think once people have been on one and if they don't have any issues with that, I think that's, that can be overcome, right? But I think it's the unexpected things, tourists or maybe the locals traveling to different parts of town and trying to ask, hey, how does the bus route go? That's sort of mundane things that I think people will have to get used to.
Right, definitely. Well, realistically speaking here, Professor, I mean, you did say that we're not going to wake up one day and everything is going to be AVs here. So how long would Singapore need in order to fully adopt an autonomous public transport system, you think?
Well, that's a very good question because I don't know at the end of the day, do we really want 100%? Are all of the bus routes really suited for AVs, or are we going to take, a maximum of maybe 50% or 70% or something like that? So that's something that I think we have to look at one bus route at a time and to see, how that is suitable or that, because the last thing you want is an autonomous running bus that is running amok, somewhere. And I think everything Land Transport Authority is trying to do is to sort of avoid that. So I think they're going to go a little bit slower, making sure, the introduction of the autonomous vehicles is not going to affect the reliability of system or affect how people will trust these vehicles or even trust the public transport system. So, and let's not forget that some of these buses people usually connect, right? So, is there problems connecting with a cart and fare, that sort of thing? So a lot of things, I think we will expect some years to get a sizable portion of all of the buses being autonomously run, I would think. So unless one is starting out, or even one is starting out as bus captains now, as a young person, I think, one could reasonably expect to have a future there until retirement, I think, because you will have bus captains retiring every year. So I think it's a long process, but gradually, and hopefully we will get there, in our lifetimes. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Siow also said that self-driving tech will have interesting implications for how Singapore approaches private vehicle ownership and by extension, the COE. So, Professor, do you think that self-driving tech could, change the dynamics of owning a car here?
I think it's a second order issue. I think, first of all, the Land Transport Authority is probably going to see how they run and the acceptability. It's one thing to have, as I mentioned earlier, with all these technologies, usually one would need a lot of an upfront cost because you're fine tuning the system, you're ironing out the bugs and so on. So it makes sense for the bus operators to do because one bus will will ply the routes a few times a day, and then it will do so every day of the week, that sort of thing. So once you invest in the upfront costs, there's a lot of economies of scale that you can gain back. But if you go into private vehicles, the problem is that people typically will drive not just to the same place. Of course, you go to work and so on, but it's more often that you would kind of deviate a little bit on your routes and so on. So the question is, are we able to get the same kind of experience to then iron out and to wait for all these unexpected occurrences to happen so that we can iron out these issues, And I think that's going to take a little bit of time.
Oh.
But if we have AVs and if we're able to get public transport ridership to a much higher level, then the private vehicles becomes, a bit of a secondary issue, right? It's like, the COE may drop, precipitously if the AVs are so good, they're run so often, and we need to increase the number of quotas allocated for buses, for example. Then that's one scenario that can play out.
Right? Definitely. Well, some great insights from you there. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining me today.
Thank you. It's nice talking with you.
Thank you. That was Terence Fan, who is the Assistant Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship and Academic Director of Accreditation at Singapore Management University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.